so God be pleased, thus live will I.
Anne Boleyn is undoubtedly the most publicised, the most beloved, the most revered, and certainly the most misunderstood of Henry's wives. She is instantly recognisable due to the many portraits in her name, and her character and image has been interpreted in countless ways, during her life and after. But who was Anne? What does she look like? How did she present herself? What characteristics did she possess that have provoked the infamy that surrounds her? For someone so instantly recognisable, there is but one contemporary image of Anne in existence, this damaged coin from 1534, most probably struck to commemorate the birth of a son that never was. It is extremely depressing for Anne fans to comprehend that this vandalised representation is probably the closest we'll ever get to a real image of our beloved Queen. There is always hope of a contemporary portrait discovery, but until this unlikely event occurs, a good idea is in existence. Eric Ives has completed a thorough analysis of the portraits of Anne in existence, and has concluded that this image, disregarding the light hair and complexion, is probably the closest we can get to a likeness. It was commissioned by Charles I, and is based on an original, most likely the Lumley portrait that was lost in 1773. The similarity between the medal and the miniature is only recognisable when we introduce the miniature that Elizabeth I had commissioned for her ring. It clearly shows the same long oval face, high cheekbones and decided chin. It is therefore likely that the lost Lumley portrait was the original that inspired the National Portrait Gallery portrait, the Hever portrait and the two monarchic miniatures. Descriptions of Anne vary from Lancelot de Carle's beautiful with an elegant figure, to Nicholas Sanders' view of her being inflicted with a projected tooth, a large wen under her chin, and 6 fingers. Sanders wasn't born until 1527, and his account is not only thoroughly biased, considering his Catholic beliefs, but can quickly be discredited, along with his assertions that Anne was in fact Henry's own daughter. You can probably tell by my intonation that it rather annoys me that these assumptions are still rife. On a recent visit to the Tower of London, I sat in horror as a yeoman warder proudly announced that Anne's body had been identified because of those 6 fingers. The truth is that her skeletal remains were exhumed and carefully examined in 1876, and it was noted clearly that she had no trace of any deformity, clearly stating that she had 10 perfectly formed slender fingers. Sanders was writing at a time when Catholicism was oppressed, and his attacks were frequent for those who were connected to the Protestant cause. His attack was really at Elizabeth, and it seems, to my horror, to have stuck. Probably the most accurate description of Anne comes from Francesco Sanuto, who described Anne as being not the most handsome woman in the world, long neck, wide mouth, and eyes which are black and beautiful. She was dark, both with regards to her hair and her complexion, and the conflict between the contemporary flexion ideal made her stand out. She may not have been a beauty, but she certainly was a good-looking woman. Queen Catherine insisted that her ladies were not ugly, and preferably pretty. One quality that Anne exuded was style, and it positively dripped from her. She injected a wave of Renaissance style into a thoroughly dehydrated and archaically styled court headed by Queen Catherine. Anne complimented Henry's extravagant and opulent dress sense, and he clearly adored keeping her sense of style enhanced, both during their courtship and as her time as queen. From Henry's privy purse inventory, we can see an enormous rise in the amount of money Henry spent on Anne. From 1530 to 1532, Henry's expenditure on Anne rose from £220 to £330 a year, with much of the expenditure dedicated to her dress. Detailed in particular was an open-sleeve cloak of black satin, lined throughout with the same material, and 3 3/4 yards of velvet at the collar and hem. Another detailed item was a black satin dressing gown, lined with black taffeta and edged with black velvet. Cut low at the neckline, the vision of the gown set against Anne's almost jet black hair would have been striking. A good idea of the power of Anne's ostentation can be seen as a reflection in her daughter Elizabeth, who learned wisely from her mother's careful and deliberate choice of clothing. Anne played a carefully planned game in her power dressing, and she adapted it according to the circumstances facing her. Denny would have us believe her romantic notion that Anne was the pioneer of the French hood, and that she despised the gable ancestor. Considering that Anne's only contemporary portrait depicts her in a gable hood, we must and should assume that she did wear them. If we should understand one thing about Anne, it is that she was dedicated to detail. When the crown was placed upon her head, she had followed the age-old traditions of the coronation ritual to the very last detail, and she was often obsessive in upholding and bettering her predecessors' traditions. Starkey and Ives both agree that at Anne's most dignified performance on the scaffold, she had been determined to die the English Queen, and therefore don the traditional gable hood. There was more to Anne's sense of image than her clothing. Her idea of image spread through the heraldic images that she proudly paraded, to the carvings of her initials that she plastered Henry's court with. Upon her elevation to Marquis of Pembroke, Anne adopted her own heraldic image, a white falcon sitting among blossoming roses from a barren tree stump. The meaning, like with many of Anne's messages, is hardly subtle. The falcon, which originated from the heraldry of the earldom of Ormond, had been adorned with an imperial crown. This not only makes a clear nod to her impending coronation, but is a lucid acknowledgement of Henry's newly established authority over the Pope. The crown itself is closed with imperial arches, and is not open as is established for mere monarchic status. The fertile red and white roses make reference to Henry's connection to both the Yorkist and Lancastrian succession, and the barren stump is not only a traditional Plantagenet symbol of monarchy, but shows Anne's forthcoming domination over the barrenness of Henry's previous marriage. This bold message is completed with a gold sceptre, a sign of authority from God. Anne truly believed that it was her destiny to become queen, which is probably why she is considered to be scheming and ruthless. It is also clear that she knew something of her fate, but carried on regardless.